Hey everybody, this is Ben dropping you a quick note. Our editors have been working hard to get episodes finished to release on schedule with the reading of the week. Our hope is that listeners will have the chance to engage with the content and share meaningful ideas in their circles of family, friends, and church. In order to meet this goal, this episode has been released with minimal editing. We are looking for additional volunteers to join the team and help with editing, social media management, and content creation. If you are interested, please reach out to us on Facebook or email latterdaypeacestudies@gmail.com. You can also donate to the project, helping us cover the costs of things like website hosting and podcast platform fees. Donations can be made through PayPal by going to our website, latterdaypeacestudies.org, clicking Get Involved, and scrolling down to the donate box. Thanks so much to all who have helped out and donated over the years. We are sincerely grateful. Latter-day Peace Studies is produced by peace-loving members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Any views expressed herein are not to be taken as official positions of the Church or its authorities.
Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thank you for joining us as we discuss this week's reading of Come Follow Me as outlined by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Our hope is that as we discuss the Scriptures, we will come to a more perfect understanding through experiencing the atonement of Jesus Christ and find greater peace in our lives. Welcome back to Latter-day Peace Studies presents Come Follow Me. I'm Christopher Hurtado.
And I'm Ben Peterson.
Thanks for being with me, Ben. As I always say, I couldn't do this without you. Today we're covering Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19 per the curriculum, but we're actually going to bring in half of John 18 too, because we find that if we do that, all of these chapters are parallel. And so I'll refer the listener again to the Parallel Gospels document I've put together. This is something that appears in the back of your standard works. The Harmony of the Gospels, I believe it's called. It just tells you which passages are parallel with which other passages, but it doesn't actually have the passages included. So what I did is I created a Google Doc where all of the passages that are parallel are actually there side by side in King James Version for your convenience. It's brilliant for studying, and we haven't been able to use it as much as we had hoped with this curriculum, but we can today if we bring in half of chapter 18 of John. So let's do that, Ben.
Yeah, so these chapters cover what I would probably call the central narrative of all of Christianity. To me, they've been kind of intimidating for us to have a single episode on this. I guess we'll see when we get into this whether it turns into 2 episodes or not, but there's a lot to cover here. I think this could have been done in 2 weeks instead of the 1 that we're getting, but we're going to go for it.
Yeah, so we go from after the Sanhedrin has their kangaroo court, we go before, Jesus goes before Pilate, right? And we go from there all the way to the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body from the cross and tombs it, which is usually the work of women. And this is all done before sundown because that's according to Deuteronomy. But I want to push back just a little bit, Ben. I do think that this is one of the most important stories in the Bible, right? For Christians. But the resurrection is as important, if not more important than the crucifixion, right?
Sure.
And we covered the garden scene, which I think has a lot of importance in Latter-day Saint tradition. We talked about the literal reading of Jesus sweating blood, whereas what we actually read in the text was a simile, right? And maybe that gets overemphasized out of a literal reading, and that somehow de-emphasizes the cross. There's also the idea that the cross has nothing to do with Latter-day Saint tradition, which is false, and I'll go into that too. And I also think that for us, Ben, the central point of Jesus's life is the teachings, right? The teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not contradicting you. I don't mean that, but there are these several things, right? We can't do without any of them. And I think that's telling, right? We have the central teachings of Jesus, we have his death, and we have his resurrection.
Yeah, I certainly think different traditions might emphasize different parts of the Gospels, but I do think that what I would call the central narrative of this, the trial, the crucifixion, and burying, and then resurrection as well of Jesus. But these 3 days, so to speak, right, are pretty central to all different Christian denominations.
Yes, and they're even central to human history in the minds of atheists, right? I mean, I can think of one at least, Slavoj Žižek, right, who sees the moment of crisis of Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, right? Father, why have you abandoned me, right?
Yeah.
that's a moment of crisis in the life of God himself, right? In the sense that he seems to, it's almost as God is having an atheist moment, right? Something like that, some kind of crisis. Yeah. So we'll come to that too. And I actually misspoke because I actually left out one of the central narratives the second time I went through them. And that is, again, Gethsemane, right? We distinguish in the Latter-day Saint tradition between Gethsemane and the cross. But I hope we get to talk a little bit more about the cross than we usually do in Latter-day Saint context and bring in some of the history of the cross in Latter-day Saintism. So we start off, I'm going to read, but I'm going to think in terms of the order of the Gospels, right, in which they're written. So I usually read Mark first, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. We're not reading here, but that's where I'm coming from and comparing. Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source, and John is class apart, right? John is doing something really different. I think we've put it this way before, and I remember Paul Toscano said this at dinner. When I had dinner with him, he said, the Synoptic Gospels tell you what happened, and this is a paraphrase, and John tells you the meaning of what happened. So the Synoptics are giving the facts, and John is giving us the meaning of those facts.
Yeah.
But some of these facts are disputable. Some of them are not included in all the Gospels. Some of them are included in some, but not all. Some are just in one. And so we hope to bring that out too as we go through these chapters.
The first thing that stood out to me in the beginning of the verses here, both in Mark and Matthew and Luke for that matter, is that we seem to have this moment of grand conspiracy here between, we got the chief priests and the scribes and the elders and the whole council, and they all gather together in order to take Jesus to the Romans, right? And, it's kind of along with the narrative here that all of these things are combining against Jesus, right? All these forces, all these powers that seem to be, again, the most powerful things in the world. They're combining against Jesus, against God, especially in the John narrative. And what comes out of it is a submission, at least in terms of what Jesus sees as his mission or as his purpose, and not so much a submission to the powers themselves. But again, this start off with this whole conspiracy is central to a lot of these narratives here, that all of these powers that be are all against Jesus. Whether that is historically accurate or not is difficult to say, but it's important to the narrative of the writers of the Gospels. Yeah,
there may be a little bit of a hint of hyperbole there, and this is something we've mentioned before. And some of the facts, as it were, as they're presented as facts, are again doubtful, right? We'll go into some of the details. But you do have Jesus before Pilate, and you have right away, right, this idea that Pilate would somehow care what the people think, whether Jews or otherwise, right? People. And that's not the historical Pilate that comes down to us, right? The historical Pilate that comes down to us really could care less what anybody thinks and just does Pilate, right?
Yeah, the historical records basically have Pilate executing people at the drop of a hat. And if he were some sort of a crowd pleaser historically, as he's presented here in some of the Gospels, it certainly wouldn't have been the crowd of Jews. He would have been more interested in Roman citizens than anybody else.
Right. And that's important, right? That the idea that Roman citizens have rights and others don't, right? Yeah, that includes even the right to do some of the things that some of the narratives tell us that Pilate has them do, right? That would be only in his own purview. By the way, off in Rome, we have the Emperor Tiberius, who's kind of a scholarly guy and kind of aloof and probably wouldn't really care what's going on. If he heard about this, he might think, ho hum, who cares, right? So that's interesting to think about too. However, we do have that the Romans are very, very highly intolerant of insurrection, right? They like their order. That's the Roman thing, Roman order, Roman law, Roman order. And anyone who's an insurrectionist is going to be crucified. And this was done, crucifixion as a punishment for non-citizens. It was typical of slaves. There's an example of the Spartacus slave revolt, right? And in the Spartacus slave revolt, something like 6,000 men were crucified along the Appian Way. It was every so many feet, there was another crucified man. And the idea is, and of course you'd have the titulus, right? The sign, the placard that says why this person was crucified. And the message is, let this be a warning to you, right? These guys did this, and this is why we crucified them. you do the same. You try anything funny, and we'll crucify you too. That's the idea. And by the way, jumping ahead to the end of the story, Ben, if I may, just real quick, Joseph of Arimathea. You said that everybody's there, the whole council. Joseph of Arimathea may actually have been a part of that council. And so I'm wondering, was he there too? What do you think, Ben?
Don't know.
Good question, huh?
I don't see any evidence of the text either way. I mean, it does talk about him being sort of a secret disciple of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so if he was there, he would have kept his mouth shut, almost maybe a la Peter, right? Maybe a tacit denial.
Yeah, there's a Book of Mormon scene that comes to my mind too.
Yeah, that's interesting, Christopher. I hadn't kind of thought of that, but that does come up with Abinadi, right? So Abinadi's before the king and all of his priests, but there is the one guy that is listening, and that's Alma, and ends up kind of advocating for Abinadi, and it has to run away because of it. But yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't kind of thought of that parallel between Joseph of Arimathea and Alma before.
Yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind.
The next thing that happens, and this is only really noted in the Gospel of Matthew, the others don't talk about it, or at least as far as Luke goes, this doesn't come up until Acts, but is the death of Judas. And we talked about this a little bit last time. Judas kind of repents of his betrayal. He goes back, tries to give the money back. They say, no, we can't take the money. And then he goes and hangs himself, right? Well, in verse 8, there's this phrase here. It says, wherefore that field, this is the field where Judas is buried, wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. And what stood out to me here, Christopher, was this phrase, to this day. This came up several times when we were covering the Old Testament, and we saw it as an indication that a lot of time had passed since the event, and it was being recounted, many years later. This might be a little bit of a tipping of the author's hand, almost, to say, hey, these events aren't being recounted necessarily by a person that witnessed them, but by somebody who is taking these accounts and compiling them many years later into their own narrative, which is basically what we understand the book of Matthew to be. And anyway, that phrase right there, just unto this day, really does sort of evoke this many years later type of commentary.
Yeah, and it's what Luke, or the author of Luke himself, tells us he's doing, right? He's compiling stories that he's heard and putting them in some kind of order. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the order here, again, these are parallel gospel passages. Sometimes, if you want to line things up side by side, if you take a look at the document, you'll see that you'll have to take some verses out of order, but all of the verses end up in there from all of the chapters. So yes, we did cover what happens to Judas after, his handing over, what's translated as betraying Jesus, and it's only translated that way for Judas. Every other time the same verb is used, it just means handing over. And there's a lot of handing over of Jesus going on. But when Judas does it, it's a betrayal. So there's a different story about what happens to him in Acts. And we already talked about that. And maybe we'll bring it up again when we cover Acts. But they don't buy the land, right, to bury him. He already owns the land, and he goes there and he doesn't hang himself. His guts just spill out. And it doesn't say anything about anybody stabbing him or him stabbing himself. They just spontaneously spill out. And that's how it gets the name of the field of blood. Whereas in this story, it is the color of the clay, and it's a potter's field, right?
Yeah. The next verse 9 says, then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value. Okay, so this verse could really only be referencing Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 6 through 9. The issue I found, Christopher, is when I went to these verses, that isn't what it said. And there wasn't really any way to tie this back to this incident of Judas. So I'm honestly not really sure what Matthew, the author of this gospel, is saying is going on here. Now, some of the commentary said actually some other texts, some other manuscripts say Zechariah, not Jeremiah. And so that would have been Zechariah 11, 12 through 13. But again, I go to those verses and there is only a passing reference to, fields or that is in relation to what is going on in this. And there doesn't seem to be any significant tie that you could look at and say, oh, this is a fulfillment of those verses. And elsewhere, where we talk about Psalms or other prophets or Isaiah that it's fulfilling, it's a lot more solid. Like you can see the actual scripture they're talking about there. Even if isn't, when we talked about Old Testament, we thought maybe this is necessarily prophesying about Jesus. There's another thing that it's focusing on. This, I couldn't see it. Like, I'm not sure what Matthew is talking about here. Because again, there's even other manuscripts that say fulfilled by the prophet Isaiah. And so there's disagreement in the manuscripts about which prophet this is fulfilling. And that makes sense to me that there'd be disagreement, because when I go to those prophets, I don't see what he's talking about.
Yeah. So Ben, as you've pointed out, and this will be a reminder for the listener who's been with us since we talked about the Old Testament. And if you're new to the show, then this might be helpful, right? When we read about the suffering servant, when we read about the Messiah, the anointed one, we found that in the Old Testament, right, that these were, first of all, two separate and distinct persons, and that they both were persons who existed at that time. That this wasn't about some future person, meaning hundreds of years into the future.
For them, it wasn't. Yeah.
Right. For them, it wasn't. But so what the gospel authors are doing is they're giving us, maybe you could say this is multiple fulfillment prophecy. That's one way to look at it, right?
It's also a renegotiation of a text.
Very much a renegotiation, and we continue to renegotiate the text. And of course, the lack of vocality that we see here too is also typical of the Old and New Testaments, right? There's not just one voice, one narrative. We have these synoptics, we have these parallel passages, but we don't have the same thing. And yes, sometimes you can say, this author left this out, but that doesn't mean it's not part of the story. And we know that, again, that these authors are collecting stories that they've heard, right, orally, and they're writing them down. And so maybe they got different versions of the story. We also see, I think we saw last week or the week before maybe, Luke trying to figure out where the sword comes from in the garden scene. And so, maybe he invents an answer to that question, because there's a sword. Well, where did it come from? And so he's the only one who has this story about where the sword comes from. And so that's why we said, well, maybe he just thought he had to come up with an explanation for how there's a sword in the story.
Now Jesus is brought before Pilate, and Pilate starts asking him some questions. In the Gospel of John, there is a much longer conversation between Jesus and Pilate, and they get into various things. In the Synoptic Gospels, he asks him a couple of questions. Jesus says, thou sayest it, right? Or so you say, type of thing, and then doesn't answer him any other questions, won't respond. So this does seem to be a little bit of incongruity here between what John is talking about and what the other Gospels say. Either John was privy to some information about a conversation between Pilate and Jesus that the other Gospel writers weren't, or John has a particular narrative that he's looking to create about Jesus's identity, which comes out in the conversation with Pilate. And that's the character that he chose to make that identity and that understanding come out in. It does make sense in line when you read through the discussion with Pilate. And there's a lot there that adds to John's theology and the narrative that he's building. So that would make sense. But again, in the other Gospels, we just don't see any sort of long conversation with Pilate, which would fit more with the character of Pilate. He's not going to spend a lot of time with this Jesus. The people say he's an insurrectionist. Sure, that's fine. If there's any question, let's just crucify him,
Right. Not hand him over to the Jews to crucify him, because that's not their place, right? Not to mention that he would not leave Pilate's custody once he was, if Pilate really thought he was an insurrectionist, then he would stay in Roman custody and he would be crucified. Now, a couple of things that came up today, Ben, here in the Hurtado home, just my wife and I talking with our kids, One is, I said something like this: the later the gospel is, the bigger the fish becomes. Do you see what I mean? We're telling the same story, but the fish keeps getting bigger and bigger. There's just more and more detail. And it's possible, right, that over time we're able to find out more details, but it's also possible that there's embellishment going on. And then the other thing, what my wife said to our kids is, because I remember one of the kids asked, why are so many things not to be taken literally in the Bible? And my wife said, because that's just how they wrote and that's how they thought, right? Everything was symbols. And here we are in the 21st century in America, where so many of us don't have any idea about symbols, right? We've become so literally minded. As a matter of fact, There's a narrative, an LDS narrative about a great apostasy, right? This narrative has been debunked even by a book recently published by the Maxwell Institute. But I think, if we want to talk about the great apostasy, I would say if there ever was one, or whether there was one or not, there seems to be one becoming now in some sense, because more and more it seems like in Latter-day Saintism that the approach to the Bible becomes more and more like evangelical, like this more literal approach. The Bible is the infallible word of God. And by that, we mean the King James Version.
Yeah.
It's not even, the original text, which you've pointed out is already problematic, right? Because the original text it varies from manuscript to manuscript, right? And from gospel to gospel even. So what do we do with this, Ben?
Well, there's something else that could be going on, in addition to what you were talking about, more detail comes out over time or the story becomes embellished. One of the things we talked about last time, the Gospel of John mentions how the Spirit is supposed to come to the people and teach them and supposed to help them understand the things that Jesus couldn't help them understand at the time. And so there is a sense in which the Christian tradition does gain consciousness over time in the sense that it is coming to understand more. So it feels over time about who Jesus is and what his mission was and their relationship with God. And so when we get to this Gospel of John, it's a more evolved sense of that idea, of that theology, or of that, we called it high Christology. And again, from a certain perspective, that is more accurate, right? It is approaching a better understanding because the people at the time just needed milk, right? And then later they could get the meat. At the time they got the basics, and now we're getting to the more meaningful things. Like you said, what happened versus the meaning of it. And so that is another way of looking at it, especially with the Gospel of John, that this is just a more evolved, deeper understanding of what's really going on that the people just couldn't understand at the time.
Yeah, so we come to have a better understanding over time. I get that. That reminds me of an author I pointed out to you. I've read his books. I haven't read his books on Christianity. I lost the plot. I was following him all the way through. He wrote about the fall of the Roman Republic. He wrote about the Augustan dynasty, the Persian Wars. He translated Herodotus. You and I both love Herodotus. He's a big fan of Herodotus himself. This is Tom Holland, the British historian. He was really into dinosaurs and Romans.
Yeah.
And he became not a paleontologist, but an historian who focuses on Rome. But he does go into Christianity. And I know I shared some videos with you, Ben, and so you may be able to better speak to what he says. I don't know if I can call him an atheist. I might have listed him among the atheists that I thought I was going to talk about. Maybe you can say if you feel like he's an atheist.
Well, the gist I got from it was that he did start out that way, but that his studies have made him more and more of a believer in terms of believing in Christ as an archetype and as a model figure. Yeah.
Yeah. And it reminds me also of Rene Girard, right? Who really, I don't remember if he was an atheist, but he really became converted in a sense to Christianity, whether from atheism or something else, right? He just saw the uniqueness of the message, right? And of what happens. Yeah. It's back to what happens, right? The facts and then the meaning.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's become even, the identification with the victim, as we've talked about with Girard, that's become a part of our society. At the same time that people have rejected Christianity, religion, that we become more secular as a society, we still actually have been influenced in many ways. And that's the thing that Tom Holland brings out, I think, in his books. And as you saw in his some lectures and things that you can find on YouTube, right? That he shows you that the meaning of what happened has become a part of who we are as a society. So for example, when he's covering the Roman Republic, when he's covering the the Augustan dynasty, right? He's trying to, and even the Greeks, he's trying to inhabit their frame of mind. And he says he found it actually disturbing. Why? Because he has a Christian upbringing. Whether he was, he said he was bored at church. His father was an atheist. His mother was a believer. He went to church. He didn't really mind one way or the other, except that he thought it was a little boring. And where are the dinosaurs, right? You have Adam and Eve, but no dinosaurs, right? But the point is that he's raised with we all are, right? This is something that I've heard said, right? That people deny in some way, that we have Christian morals, whether we believe in Christ or not.
Yeah, there does seem to be something there, at least the way that Tom Holland was talking about it, in terms of this ethic that's ingrained in the society, that the fundamental value of the individual, of a human being, that wasn't the premise of the Greek or Roman societies, right? The premise of those was the citizen of Rome or the citizen of the Greek city is important, but people outside of this, the them, right? There's nothing inherently important about them. What's important is that we build our society and we promote our values and our ethic and our nationalism, right? Or what they would term religion, but is kind of a different thing for them than what we call religion now.
And it is more like nationalism, as you said.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how you treat slaves or how you treat women or how you treat people from another, country, so to speak, it didn't matter so much within the ethic. Whereas Christianity comes in and kind of turns that over and says, no, every single person has inherent value. And even if there are times throughout Christian history or, a big part of Christian history, there are justifications and ways of trying to deny that, those were always the counter to it, right? Like that wasn't the default. You always had to come up with a justification for slavery or a justification for these other things. You didn't just say that this is the right thing, period.
Right. And I think it's worth pointing out that many who call themselves Christians have committed all kinds of atrocities in the name of Christ, right? But that's not the Christian message.
Yeah.
The Christian message is one in which there is value in the individual. And one other thing to say is that this isn't entirely new with Jesus, right? This is something that was already present in Stoicism, especially, right? Whether it be love of enemies, cosmopolitanism, meaning the whole world is my city, right? Not just Rome.
Yeah, we were starting to see the seeds of this in, the Jewish scripture when we were covering the Old Testament.
Exactly, that too, and so Seneca, the famous Roman Stoic, is born the same year as Jesus, somewhere between 6 and 4 BC, just like Jesus. And so that's the predominant philosophy of the time, which again, religion is more like the relationship between man and the state, between human beings and their state, whereas philosophy was about man's relationship to other men or other humans, right? Humans to humans and humans to God.
Or to themselves, like how they comport themselves. Yeah.
Or to themselves, right? Exactly. Yeah.
So that is important to keep in mind, I guess, when we get into this trial that Jesus and this discussion he's having before Pilate and the mindset that Pilate's in, right? The historical mindset versus whatever Pilate we're seeing in the text here that does seem to be concerned with the will of the crowd, as if he's a crowd pleaser. And Pilate historically wouldn't have had those concerns, right? About the justice of what was happening. He wouldn't have been concerned with that.
Not to other than Roman citizens, right? Certainly not insurrectionists.
Yeah. Yeah, and to that point, we get to hear the point in the story where the Barabbas is brought in, or as in some of the text, it's Jesus Barabbas, right? He even has the same name as Jesus.
Right, and Barabbas means son of the Father. Yeah. So now you have Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, son of the Father. Isn't that fun?
Well, they distinguish between him as Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, who is called Messiah, right? The anointed one. So
That's right, the anointed one, yes. But they're both Jesus, son of the Father, right?
Yeah.
And so he's an insurrectionist, right? And Pilate, in this narrative, he wants to please the crowd, and you get to decide, I don't find anything wrong with this guy. I don't know what your problem is with him, but, you choose, right? And they choose Barabbas. And so, okay, we're going to let him go. He's an insurrectionist, but we're going to let him go. And we're going to turn over Jesus to you. And this is just untenable in the historical context.
Yeah, Pilate wouldn't have done that. Yeah. Well, and to that point, I think what is being then said here in the text is that, again, all things are conspiring against Jesus, and the people are so against him that they're even willing to let Barabbas go, or Pilate is so afraid of the people's bloodlust that he's only going to push back against it so far. And at a certain point, he's afraid to push back anymore. Right. And that's why he washes his hands of it and all that sort of thing, at least in the narrative again. And so they're going to release Barabbas, who is a real insurrectionist, because Jesus is the one that the people are focused their bloodlust on, which, brings in Girard, right? This scapegoat that everybody has focused on. He is the cause of all the problems here.
That's right. Now we get in John that one of the questions that Pilate has for Jesus that Jesus doesn't answer, by the way, is, where are you from?
Yeah.
Ben, you suggested in our pre-show discussion that perhaps he was trying to punt, and just send him off to someone else to deal with. What's the jurisdiction, for this, right? And so I actually found here in Luke 23:6, right? When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were Galilean. Verse 7, and as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time.
Right. And yeah, in the text, Pilate doesn't want to deal with, like, he sees that this might turn into a problem, right? He doesn't want to be the one that has to deal with this sort of a problem. So he'd like it to not be in his backyard, so to speak, it seems. But it comes back to him anyway.
Right. So now Herod's going to question him. And by the way, this is only in Luke, right? We only see this in Luke. It's only in John that he gets asked, where are you from? And it's only in Luke that he's asked whether he's a Galilean and then sent off to Herod for, the jurisdiction over Galilee. And so this again, to me, actually, I see the possibility of one and the same story told in different ways, right? This is one instance where I can see that. And it's interesting, Ben, that Herod just happens to be in Jerusalem in this narrative, right? It would be, you'd have to send Jesus off to Galilee, but it just so happens Herod is in Jerusalem. And so he can go before Herod without going anywhere. That's really convenient.
I guess he's there for the Passover. Or...
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Most likely.
So in any case, Jesus does end up with Pilate, whether he goes to Herod and then comes back to Pilate or stays with Pilate. And Pilate begins to question him again. In the other Gospels, except John, Jesus doesn't really answer Pilate. He's not having a discussion. It says he answered him nothing. And we talked about this a bit ago when he has this longer conversation with John. But I just thought it's interesting that the other Gospels seem to be pretty insistent on the fact that Jesus doesn't say anything to Pilate, but he does in John.
Right. And then there's this long conversation between Pilate and Jesus in John, which is written much later, toward the end of the first century, maybe even in the second century, beginning of the second century. And then this also begs the question, how do we know what was said how does anybody know what was said between Jesus and Pilate? Is there a place there for anyone other than the bigwigs, right? Of course, the Sanhedrin are there, Pilate, Herod, Jesus, of course, the accused, but is anybody else there? His disciples even ran away. And if they hadn't run away, they have no place there anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can think of any point in the Gospels where the writers of the Gospels say, hey, I know this because of, X, Y, Z. We could certainly come up with, conjecture. Oh, well, after Jesus was resurrected, he explained it to them and, told them the story so that they could write it down, or they got it from Revelation later, or, there's all kinds of different ways that we could think of it. But there's no indication in the text that they were firsthand witnesses at the time of this conversation that he's having with Pilate, right?
Right. We have your earlier explanation too, right, of John, that is, as promised by Jesus, he would send the Paraclete, and the Paraclete would then teach them, right? So they, the meaning of all this, what happened, comes out later. And that's certainly what John is doing.
Yeah.
He's making meaning out of the events that happen. And by the way, that's what we do, right? As human beings. On our sister podcast, Latter-day Contemplation, Shiloh Logan and I recorded an episode on the stories we tell ourselves, right? Our whole identity is based on stories we tell ourselves. Now, first, parents tell us stories, right? You're an American, you're a Latter-day Saint, you're whatever, right? And so we take on all these stories and they become who we are in some sense. And whatever happens to us, again, we tell stories. We tell ourselves stories. There's something called narrative fallacy, right? The idea that our life is somehow going somewhere, like there's this plot, like a novel or something. Whereas, and it's interesting because experimental writers of novels today are writing novels without plots, without narrative, right? That are supposed to be truer to life, because that's how life really is. It's just what happens, right? And then, so there's what happens, and then there's the story we tell ourselves about what happens. And that's where John comes in, is he's telling us the meaning of what happened. So he has a longer conversation in his gospel between Jesus and Pilate. So then we have Jesus and Barabbas. We know what happens there. The people choose Barabbas, and according to the narrative, Pilate's going to allow them that choice. Now the torture begins, right? Yeah. Before the crucifixion. By the way, of all the things that we've mentioned that are maybe historically, doubtful, right? The one thing that is not doubtful is Jesus of Nazareth was crucified.
Yeah.
This is something everybody agrees on. Even Slavoj Žižek, right? For example. Yeah. And then, of course, some of the things that happen next before the crucifixion, they're part and parcel of what happens to someone who's going to be sentenced to crucifixion. He's going to be tortured, right? They're going to scourge him. So they use these leather strips with either lead or bones on the ends of them. And while the Jews had, according to Torah, they had 40 lashes as a limit, the Romans had no limit. Now, by the way, 40 lashes could just be the symbolic, a good whipping, right?
Yeah.
Enough of a whipping. But the Romans had no limit. And so Jesus gets flogged, right? And then they're making fun of him, right? They put a scarlet robe on him. They put a garland crown. Now, why a garland? Is it they're doing something makeshift? We don't have an actual crown? No, it's because that is the Greco-Roman crown. It's a garland. Now, probably not with thorns. We don't usually put a garland with thorns on the actual emperor, but the emperor did in fact wear a garland. There's no metal crown. So they're making him a crown plated with thorns in this case, and they put it on his head, and he's going to be spit upon and mocked and smitten. But this doesn't appear in all the Gospels, right? It's not actually in Luke. And that's interesting, right? That Luke doesn't have any of this happen. This scene that we could call Behold the Man, right?
And this could be considered a typical Roman thing. So, for instance, when Rome would conquer peoples, they would often take their chiefs or their monarchs, and they would publicly humiliate them as a way of showing Rome's power. And so if Jesus is being convicted here as, quote, King of the Jews, then this is something they would have done to mock him. And it could have been done at other times to other chieftains, other monarchs, and so forth. So,
indeed. And so then he's going to be crucified, right? That's what comes next.
Yeah, wow. So this is potentially, in all of human history, probably the worst way to die, or one of the worst ways to die. It's quite an invention of imperial cruelty. And I don't know that we necessarily need to go into all the details of what happens to a person when they're crucified, but it's awful. It's actually where we get our word excruciating, right? Because there's no other way to describe something than to just reference this experience in some ways.
Yeah, it's the crux, right? The crux is the Latin, and you can hear that in excruciating, right? Well, okay, it's there. Excruciating, C-R-U-X. So, Ben, I don't think we need to go into it, but I do think, again, if we take literally that Jesus sweat blood instead of reading the simile, as it were, right, as actually appears in the text, and we play that one up, we do somehow end up playing down the crucifixion in our tradition, right? And part of that is the idea that the cross has nothing to do with our tradition. I think this is maybe a good point to bring this up, right?
Yeah.
There is a book on the cross in the Latter-day Saint tradition. That book is called Banishing the Cross, The Emergence of a Mormon Taboo, and it's by Michael G. Reed. And I just want to read a passage from that book. Indeed, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, many Latter-day Saints individually used and promoted the symbol of the cross in its visual and material form. The current taboo emerged among Mormons at the grassroots level around the turn of the 20th century and became institutionalized mid-century under the direction of David O. McKay, president of the LDS Church, 1951 to 1970. So the cross was a part of the Latter-day Saint tradition. When it did go away, it was grassroots, right? It was from the bottom up, not from the top down. And only later does it become top-down institutionalized under David O. McKay. And it's interesting because, if we think about the early Christians, it was shameful that Jesus died on a cross. And it took until the Middle Ages for there to be art that would actually admit, right, that Jesus was crucified, right? And he would appear on the cross. Of course, he would appear with a loincloth. That's not how crucifixion works. If I do mention one detail about the crucifixion, I will say you were crucified naked. That's part of the humiliation. And especially for a Jew, who was brought up with a sense of modesty when it comes to, nakedness, right? It's part of the shame. Right? You're just crucified naked, and you are, and there's the placard, the titulus that's going to tell us why you're crucified. And you're there as, it's almost like a billboard, but it's advertising Roman rule, Roman order, Roman law, and what happens to anyone who dares to stand up to Rome in any way, shape, or form.
Right. So for early Christians, even we look at the letters of Paul, which are the earliest writings that we have earlier than the Gospels, and he says he's in one sense scandalized by the cross, right? Like he says that this is a strange symbol to be using. It's odd to him. Or this was a symbol of the imperial power of Rome. It wasn't a symbol of a religion. It wasn't a symbol of your faith. But the Christians over time took that and decided to use that as a symbol of that thing. And especially after the time of Constantine, that would have become a thing later.
Ben, that reminds me, listeners might find it interesting to know what some of the early symbols of Christianity were, right? And one was the fish. Mm-hmm. And that's still actually seen on bumper stickers today, mm-hmm. right? Or on bumpers in some way, shape, or form. And then the anchor. Did you know about that one, Ben? The anchor? And the anchor, it has a little play on words in it because the Greek is like, the English comes from the Greek, right? So it's ankur. It's a play on words because ankurios means in the Lord.
Oh, okay.
All right, and this is typical of John, right? To say we are all one in Christ, right? En Christos. Very common for him to say that, right? And so en kurios is the Greek for Lord. So en kurios ankur, right? It sounds like anchor. I'm looking forward to spotting some of these symbols if I can find them. I'll be looking for them in Ravenna, where some of the earliest Christian inscriptions are found this summer.
So they're going to lead Jesus out to be crucified here. In the Synoptics, he isn't able to carry the cross the whole way, or at least at some point somebody else has to carry it for him. It doesn't say that in John. It says that he went all the way, or at least it seems to say that in the Gospel of John, that he went all the way with the cross. Now, I think it bears pointing out here that the cross that he's carrying or is being carried on his behalf is just the cross piece. It's just the T of the bar, right? It's not the whole cross. They would have already driven the pole into the ground, and then he would have just been carrying that cross piece that is then taken out. He's nailed to it and then lifted up. And that is portrayed, I think, in some of the videos that I've seen of the fact that he's carrying that crossbar. I realized as I was visualizing that the crossbar that he's carrying is a lot like we might visualize a yoke. And so earlier in the Gospels, Jesus uses that phrase of the yoke. He says, take up your yoke, or take my yoke upon you. Or what we might term as a yoke would be symbolic of a daily burden or the responsibilities of your life. And you take that up and you follow Christ, or you take up his yoke or his cross, in this case, right, upon us. And so there seems to be an equivocation between the carrying of the cross that Jesus is doing in this scenario and his imperative to the people that they take his yoke upon them. And so there's something, again, that is going on between this phrase of the cross, or carrying the cross, and taking up our yoke as well.
Ben, this reminds me of another conversation Riley and I had on our sister podcast, Latter-day Contemplation. We had a guest, Phil McLemore. Phil McLemore wrote some articles on the yoga of Christ for, I think it's either Dialogue or Sunstone. And it's interesting because yoke actually comes from the same root as yoga. It comes from the Sanskrit yug, right? And this is where we get yoga. So yoga, most people know of yoga as, what should I call it? Exercise, right? Doing poses, and it's a form of physical exercise. But yoga is actually a spiritual practice, and the poses are only part of it. That's sort of the outward part of it, and there's an inward part of it. And so it's a spiritual practice.
It's also meant as a way of life, is it not? Like, that's kind of the idea. Yoga is your...
It is, right? And there are different yogas, right? There are different spiritual practices that one can yoke oneself to, to either that practice or to God through that practice, you could say, right? And so that's worth checking out too on Latter-day Contemplation.
Yeah, so I've heard it discussed as, as a way, like the way that we conduct our lives. And if this becomes tied to or analogous to the cross, right, this is also the way. Jesus is saying he's the way, right? Or following Jesus, we're also following him in his way of carrying his cross. And I forget who said it, but it was, I might be paraphrasing, everyone wants to follow Jesus, until they see where he's going.
Yeah, until they find out where he's going, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I find out he's carrying his cross and he's headed to his death.
But to our, nonviolent, the core of our exegesis, right, is to with our program here is to offer nonviolent exegesis. This was the core of Jesus's teaching, right, is nonviolence. And so if Rome wants to crucify you, then you crucify you, and you don't fear those who can kill only the body, right?
Right. So I think the question here is why did Jesus consent to die? I mean, in the Gospels here, we have him saying, especially when they come to get him in the garden and Peter takes the sword, right, and cuts off the ear. And Jesus says, put it away. I can get legions of angels to come and protect me, but I'm not doing that. I'm consenting to this, right? Why is Jesus consenting to this? I think all the Gospels, in a sense, try to answer this question. And there's a lot of answers that have been given over the centuries. Why is it that Jesus consented to do this? Why is it that he agreed, so to speak, to be crucified? I don't think there has to be one particular answer. Maybe it can be a combination of things. But I do think one of the answers to this question that doesn't get enough discussion is wrapped up in the conversation that we've been having, Christopher, about Girard and his ideas of mimetic violence. So I think in one sense, we could say that Jesus consents to die in order to demonstrate that violence isn't necessary. The scapegoating isn't necessary. So the idea is that Jesus' suffering and death are a way for us to identify with the victims of mimetic violence. And we can see this in multiple scriptures. I'm going to bring in Jacob from the Book of Mormon. Jacob chapter 1, verse 8. Jacob says that we are to view his death, that is Christ, and suffer his cross and bear the shame of the world. Now, the point you were talking about, Christopher, with the history of the symbolism of the cross in Latter-day Saint thought and religious experience, this goes all the way back to the Book of Mormon. Even the Book of Mormon is talking about the cross as a symbol of Jesus, or of his religion, of his experience, of his life, and what we're supposed to observe and emulate. So going back to that idea of the victims of mimetic violence that are being pointed to here, I was kind of thinking like, okay, so if Jesus is this sort of supreme example of a victim of mimetic violence, and that is supposed to demonstrate to us that this is a futile or unnecessary, the scapegoating type of thing, who are these victims of mimetic violence? Especially throughout history, I think we can look at the casualties of war. I mean, war is potentially this supreme example of mimetic violence.
Ben, to your point, unless you're a psychopath, right, unless you're a serial killer, you don't go out and kill people.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But soldiers do when others around them are doing the same thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we look at the 20th century, over 100 million people were killed in wars during the 20th century. I was just doing some quick research on this, and obviously numbers are difficult to find for all of history, but there was one researcher that said that they estimated around 1 billion people since recorded history had been killed in wars, like directly killed in wars. But the 100 million I talked about during the 20th century, that doesn't include people that are mass executed or starved by governments, which also happened quite a bit. And those are also examples of mimetic violence, right? Happening at an institutional state level, people's deaths.
Right. We could say, I don't know if this is going too far. Tell me if I'm going too far, Ben. We could say that Hitler acted in some sense mimetically. Again, John is always talking about the Jews, right? The Jews did this, the Jews did that, and these aren't good things, right? This is the things against Jesus. What we see in the Greek is Judaioi, which could be translated to Jews and apply to all Jews, but could also be translated to Judeans. And I think if we're reading John correctly, it's the Judeans, and it's not actually even the Judeans, it's the authorities among the Judeans that he's talking about. But I think, when we continue to talk about this, even in Latter-day Saint circles, as though, the Jews, they didn't get it, right? There's still an anti-Semitism that it's enough of an anti-Semitism that it makes me uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something we need to watch out for. I think these things start small, right? They start small and seemingly insignificant, and they can become issues. Anytime that we are engaging in something that is otherizing someone in a way to dehumanize them, this is the kind of thing that comes about. And it's one of the ways that mimetic violence becomes possible within our psyche.
Yes. I mean, we may be the one casting the first stone in doing this, or we may be unwittingly falling for it and joining the crowd, as it were, right?
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be ironic if Jesus died to show the futility of the scapegoat mechanism and we fell for it, as it were, and considered his death a scapegoat? That we would interpret that he died for us or died for our sins in that way.
Yeah, that's certainly one way of looking at it. I mean, I know that even within that narrative, there is sort of this, what I might call like a stopgap, because we get this, that ends sacrifice by the shedding of blood. So like the idea is that even if we are to view it that way, which I think you have a really good argument for why we shouldn't, but even if we are, that's supposed to be the final one, right? That's supposed to be it. There's not supposed to be any more after that.
Well, and again, to continue to make my case, and I'm making this case with Gerard, right?
Yeah.
Isn't every scapegoat saying that, right? Every scapegoating incident is saying, if we just kill this guy, that's it, right? It's going to solve all our problems. And the Roman, the Pax Romana was all about, if we can just conquer everybody, there's just, one more or however many more people to conquer, and then we'll have Roman rule. And then there's peace, right? It's peace through victory. This is the project of Rome. And just like the scapegoat mechanism doesn't work because it's founded on a murder and a lie, and by the same token, this idea that you can conquer everyone and therefore have peace is also a chimera.
Well, it's the conceit of war. So there's always like, okay, if we just win this battle, or we just build this weapon, or we can just demonstrate our strength in this way, or we just kill this one more person, or just beat this one more dictator, right? Then that will accomplish our goal. It's always that. And this is even studied within, understanding war theories and what we might term just war theory. The idea that, there's a certain way that you can go about defense.
Oh, yeah.
And if you do that in just the right way, then it's justified. But the problem there becomes that everybody believes they're acting in defense.
Of course. And they're justified.
Yeah. Even the preemptive war is a defensive tactic, right? And so this always comes about in that way.
And it's hard to fit preemptive war into any actual just war theory, right? In defense of just war theory. But then now I'm going to speak against just war theory. And I just want to point out to anybody in the Latter-day Saint tradition who holds to just war theory, consider this. It comes from, and I don't have anything against Catholicism in saying this, but it does come from the Catholic tradition. It comes from St. Augustine. That's how it comes into the Christian tradition. And the Catholic Church itself has recently repudiated it. What are we waiting for? Why are we still following this false tradition?
I would add that especially President Nelson's most recent address on peacemaking does seem to make some pretty strong statements against what someone might justify within that just war theory as well.
Indeed.
So I think Jesus's crucifixion, his death, invites us to resist the power of mimetic violence, to take upon ourselves his yoke or his cross, in that we identify with the victims. And we, as the Book of Mormon puts it, lay down our weapons of war.
Amen.
So speaking of this mimetic violence, and it's not just, physical violence, but there's this whole mob mentality that's all tied into what's going on here. And it's really across the Gospels that we see this, even in John, where, yes, the crowd is calling for his blood, but then even when they know he's being led to be crucified, they're still mocking him, right? And spitting on him and saying, "Oh, save yourself." And even when he gets there and is nailed to the cross, you've got these two other, what are they called, malefactors or robbers or bandits or whatever in the Gospels that are crucified next to him, and they begin to mock him as well. They kind of join in.
The guys being crucified.
Yeah, they are being crucified themselves, and they are joining in this, mob ridicule of Jesus. I don't know, I don't know how historical this would be, because it seems to me that if somebody's being crucified, their whole energies is focused on just breathing, right? Being able to talk very much at all. I mean, we have Jesus not saying very much on the cross, which makes sense, but they seem to be talking an awful lot for people that are being crucified, if I'm understanding crucifixion correctly here. And so I do think this is part and parcel, even if it's not historical. There's something going on here within the narrative saying that even these guys who are crucified next to Jesus are caught up in this mimetic mob mentality.
And on the other hand, and this is where Girard points out Christianity is unique, you have those who are not participating in the scapegoat mechanism, right? Who don't fall for it. The only way you have to enter into this mob mentality, right? For you to believe that this person is the cause of all your society's woes and that killing this person is going to solve all your problems, you have to be deluding yourself, right? And this is something that people do together. You need somebody to cast the first stone. The people who took Jesus before the Roman authorities are there to do that, right? They're there to say, crucify him, right? They toss the first, second, third stone, as it were. And then the mob just joins in, right? Join in the chant, crucify him, right? And it becomes, just imagine yourself in that crowd. I think we all like to think that we would be the one who would say or do otherwise. So did Peter.
This is brought up sometimes in the context of Nazi Germany as well. And any of these types of scenarios where people think, oh, well, if I were there, I wouldn't have participated in that. I wouldn't have been part of that. And the fact is that most likely you would have been.
Yeah, there's an interesting tidbit I picked up on in my graduate studies, studying terrorism, which included, state violence. And in fact, my focus was on state violence, not on non-state actors. It's that the SS, the Schutzstaffel, right? The people who were hunting down anybody who would be against the Nazi regime were not that many people. They weren't actually hunting down anybody. They just showed up when your neighbors ratted on you.
Yeah.
Just to do the paperwork. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like they're not really hunting down anybody. The Nazis didn't need that many of them because they counted on people ratting out their neighbors.
So there's several phrases among the different Gospels that Jesus says on the cross. One of them is not attested in all of the manuscripts, but it is one that we quote quite a bit. And this is verse 34 of Luke chapter 23. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Or in KJV, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, there's some very interesting things going on in this sentence or this phrase here. And like I was saying, it doesn't exist in all the manuscripts, so it's possible that this was added later. And so even if this wasn't like a actual quote of Jesus, I think it fits with the overall theme of the Gospels and the character of Jesus that's portrayed in them. You brought up a point, Christopher, that here this is also potentially a commentary on that concept of the mimetic violence because, again, they don't really know what they're doing, right? They're just kind of acting impulsively, instinctually, following orders, so to speak.
That's right. Yeah, well, if you're in the mob mentality, if you're falling for the scapegoat mechanism, then you don't know what you're doing. That's how it works by definition. If you knew what you were doing, it wouldn't work. If you told yourself the truth, right? Because again, this is a murder and a lie. If you told yourself the truth, I'm killing this person who has nothing to do with, who was an innocent victim to solve my problems, you would realize that just doesn't work. But if somebody again casts that first stone and says, crucify him, or in the Apollonius of Tyana story, stone him, right? Or in the story of the woman taken in adultery, as we call it, okay, who's going to cast the first stone, right? Then you realize it doesn't really work if you're thinking about it. And that's, I think, as we covered, that story in taking a Girardian approach, we said just the fact that Jesus slows things down by pausing and having the people reflect, asking them questions, that in and of itself means that they do know what they're doing, and therefore they wouldn't do it. You know, Socrates taught that if they really knew what they were doing were wrong, they wouldn't do it. And I have a hard time with that. I had a hard time with that. I first heard that formulated, you know, similarly by a friend of my wife, you know, my then wife. And I thought, no, that's not true. That can't be true. He knows what he's doing, and he did it to me anyway, right? But then, you know, I've come to understand that I think Socrates was right. You know, I think people don't realize what they're doing. They don't realize when they're harming themselves, as Socrates put it, harming their own souls. In English, we distinguish between the self and the soul. In Hebrew and Greek and Arabic, they're the same thing, right?
Or we have nefesh, which might mean neck, right?
There is that too. It's either your soul or your neck. You're up to your soul or you're up to your neck. Back to Jonah. You know, Job and Jonah just come up. And I think that's because of the archetypal nature of those stories, right? I think it really shows you that these are true stories. They have that kind of truth, right? That's this eternal truth.
Myths, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, they're true stories in the sense that they teach something true, not in the sense that they're historical. And that's why they can come up in any context throughout history. We just keep bringing them up, Ben. Yeah. They just keep coming up.
Yeah. Another thing Jesus is quoted as saying while on the cross is this phrase that is given in Aramaic and then translated for the reader. And I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it correctly, but I'm going to go for it anyway. He says, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. So this is the my God, why hast thou forsaken me phrase. This comes out of Psalms, and there's probably a lot. Well, I know there's quite a bit that could be said about this phrase. I'm going to bring up something that we said before, especially when we had a discussion about Psalms and then the book of Esther. So this phrase has a lot to do with the Jewish mentality after the exile and the idea that they had been abandoned by God as a people. And when we get to the book of Esther, which the book itself makes no mention of God at all, or any really religious practice for that matter, except for fasting and except for Purim, which is then the commemoration of the event in Esther in any case.
Hold on, Ben. Rhetorical question. Just want to slow you down. Mm-hmm. The book of Esther does not mention God.
Correct.
Not once. Yeah. Why? Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Why? I think you have an answer.
Yeah, and it kind of is wrapped up in this concept of the idea that God had abandoned the people. And at least when we brought in some commentary from Aviva Zornberg on the book of Esther, she referenced several midrash on this, and one was particularly fascinating to me. It talked about the point at which Esther goes to talk to the king about the problem. Her people are going to be executed. She fasts for 3 days beforehand, and on the third day, here's that thing that keeps coming up all the time within Jewish scripture, on the third day, right? It even comes up here in the New Testament, one of the most significant phrases about Jesus' resurrection. But the idea here is that on the third day, especially after you're fasting, that's when God is supposed to reveal himself. That's when you're supposed to be delivered. And so even though God isn't mentioned explicitly in the book of Esther, he is conspicuously absent in the sense that when you have phrases like this, on the third day, and then she goes and there's nothing, there's a midrash, which again is this rabbinical commentary. It's not in the text. It's these rabbis after the fact that are going back and analyzing this and bringing cultural context to it and ideas about what could have been going on in the mind of Esther, so to speak. That Esther says this phrase, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, as she takes this step forward because she doesn't feel God with her in that moment when she's going to speak to the king. And she expected that she would, because this is the third day after the fast. And she says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And yet she still takes that step, even after she feels abandoned by God. And that's that moment of true courage that Esther has, because she's doing it alone without God. And so when this phrase is put in the mouth of Jesus or uttered by Jesus on the cross, it brings all of this baggage with it, this idea of the abandonment of God as a people. But then it becomes personified and focused within the person of Jesus in his moment of suffering and of greatest need, that God has abandoned him. In the book of Matthew, this is particularly important because one of Matthew's purposes seems to be to personify the people of Israel within the person of Jesus, and to show that he is the fulfillment of them as a people. And they're supposed to view themselves in Jesus, and that's how he's going to deliver them. And so he utters this phrase as sort of an echo of that moment in Jewish history, or that period of time in Jewish history when they felt abandoned. And so the idea is that you identify with that. Again, this is going back to identifying with the victim on the cross.
Man, that's good midrash, Ben.
So as the people are hearing this phrase, this Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, then they start asking, oh, is he calling for Elijah? And this always seemed odd to me, but, Eli is the name, or it sounds really close to Elijah when he says it. And so the idea is that the people think that's what he's saying for. Elijah is apparently the person you call for in need, right? And so the idea is that they think that he's asking for aid from Elijah. So,
well, and Jesus has been associated with Elijah in various ways, throughout the text. So it hadn't occurred to me before, Ben. He's speaking Aramaic, and the people who hear him and mistake perhaps don't know Aramaic. Perhaps they're Greek speakers. They're Romans. I don't know who's there. Well, actually, we're going to go into that a little bit, right? In terms of who's there, that's significant, right? In terms of who's at the crucifixion, right? Who are the witnesses?
Yeah. So obviously we've got the soldiers, but in the Gospels, the witnesses are mentioned particularly as women, right? Apparently all the apostles, except for maybe one, they fled, right? They've run away. They're scared of the situation. Yeah. But in the book of John, we do get some indication, and this seems to be traditionally interpreted as John himself, or John the Apostle, John the Beloved, is mentioned as this person.
Ben, can I just ask you? Let's pan out a bit. You have a good rule of thumb for reading the Gospel of John, and that applies here. Maybe you could give us the rule of thumb, and then go back into this particular incident.
In the Gospel of John, there's often times when there is an ambiguous person referenced, a certain apostle, or that other disciple, or the disciple who Jesus loved, or, it's always referenced in the third person and ambiguous, and it's never named as John. It's always just, not always, I should say, but it traditionally has been interpreted as John. And so then that is why the Gospel of John is attributed to John. But nowhere in the Gospel of John does the author identify himself as John, right? These are just sort of these inferences that we're making.
Right. So how does that apply here?
So at this point, there is a moment after Jesus's death when it's getting close to the end of the day, and the Jews don't want the bodies on the crosses anymore. So they have the soldiers go through to break the legs of the people. And the idea here is with crucifixion that the only thing that's keeping you alive is the fact that you can stand up a little bit. But if you can no longer stand up, then you're going to eventually suffocate because you can't get enough air. Well, if your legs are broken, then you can't stand up anymore. And so the suffocation is going to happen faster. So in order to speed the process along, they are going to break the legs of these people. Well, they get to Jesus, and it says that they see that he's already dead. And so they're not going to break his legs. There's no need for that. But a soldier takes a spear and jabs it into his side, and blood and water come out immediately, it says. And in the next verse, it says, "And he that saw it bare record, and his record is true. and he knoweth that he saith true, that ye might believe. So this ambiguous he that this verse is referencing does seem to, again, has been traditionally interpreted as the disciple John, or John the Beloved. And then again, that becomes interpreted as, well, then he's the author of this gospel. I think that, that's not necessarily a bad string of logic there, but I think that there are some leaps it takes. And one of the leaps it takes is that even if this person there that witnessed this was John, the disciple John, he certainly could have passed down his account orally or maybe written it down. And the person who wrote the Gospel of John would have taken that account and incorporated it into what they are writing. So I don't think that it infers that John wrote this gospel.
Well, I think when we call it the Gospel of John, we just mean the Gospel according to John. Yeah. So even if he didn't write it, he's saying, if we think that this he is John, and I do think it's John. And by the way, Ben, you originally read it otherwise, and I think it might be helpful for the listener to think about, how it might be misread. But I do think it is John, and I think that it is a self-reference. He's saying, I saw this myself, and I'm testifying. This is what happened.
Yeah. I think when I read it through once, I thought the he pronoun was referring to the soldier. And I had to read it a few times before I got it in my head. No, this isn't the soldier. This is the person who sees the soldier doing this. And so it's
right.
It's another person. It's a quote unquote he.
Now, Ben, I precipitated us into a discussion of John himself being present, right? And that's an important aspect of the story. But perhaps we should have started with the ladies first, right? So present at this scene are three Marys. Mm-hmm. I didn't share this with you pre-show, Ben. There's a fun note in Rudin's translation, in a comment, a footnote, where she says, this idea that you would have three Marys in one story, in the same story, doesn't happen in ancient literature unless it's comedy.
Oh.
And that's curious, isn't it?
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. What's happening here literarily? Why are they being put here?
I don't know literally. I thought it was a provocative comment from her, something to think about. But what I wanted to say about the three women who are there, the three Marys, is that these are, again, no, a couple of things. Something new came to my mind when you mentioned the disciples running away, by which I think you meant the male disciples, right?
Yes.
So Jesus has female disciples. They're present. It hadn't occurred to me before I heard you say that they ran away in that way, because that already happened before we get to the crucifixion. But when you said it while we're talking about the crucifixion, I realized, wait a minute. If Jesus is an insurrectionist and you're a male disciple of Jesus, you're a threat.
Right. And
you can't show your face there, right? Because you would be probably crucified too. But the women can just be there and they're less threatening, right? Mm-hmm. That's a new reading for me.
Well, they could also be there in consequence of their duty to take care of the body once he's dead.
So. That's right, which they don't end up carrying out. Yeah. Enter Joseph of Arimathea, right? And that's interesting too. We'll come to that. But these women are there. It has been these women all along who have bankrolled the Jesus movement, mm-hmm. right? They're the ones paying the bills. There are some expenses, however minimal, even if you don't have a place to lay your head, if you're moving around and you're feeding 5,000 people. That was a joke. But, somebody else did that, right? But, the point is, these are followers of Jesus, and these are well-to-do women, women with their own means. They're likely widows, right? Because they have this independence, they have their own means. That happens only with widows in antiquity. And by the way, there's two ways to read this, right? I could say Mary Magdalene was most likely not a prostitute, or she would not have been, these other women would not have associated with her, because these are women of status. Another way to read it that I thought was interesting, I'm going to give credit to my daughter who brought this up. We both thought of it, but she mentioned it to me. She said, or it just shows you the spirit of Jesus, right, is in those women. Right? And that's what Jesus is going around, eating with people you're not supposed to eat with, and fellowshipping with people you're not supposed to fellowship with.
Yeah.
So that it could be either way. But there's certainly women of status at this point and of their own means. And they're there. And they don't actually bury Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea comes along and does that.
So verse 50 of Matthew chapter 27 recounts Jesus' actual death. In the KJV, we get the phrase yielded up the ghost. And that's just not something we use in our vernacular anymore, right? Like you gave up, I guess we say gave up the ghost, but we're really just referring to this verse when we say that, or one of the verses from the gospel when we say gave up the ghost. Really what's happening here is the pneuma, right? The holy life breath. And so when we go to NRSV, we get breathed his last, or, it's his last breath, or just kind of let out that exhale. He's giving up that life breath. So life isn't in him anymore. So this is one of those verses, Christopher, that I would like to get the Rudin translation on. See what she says.
I knew you were going to ask me. But once again, Jesus cried out with a loud voice and gave up his life breath.
There you go.
Yeah, we're translating pneuma, right? So it's the life breath that gives you life, right? This is the point. God creates Adam, right? Human, out of humus, and breathes the life breath into him. Well, into them, I should say. And so when you breathe out the life breath, that's it. And once you can't stand up, it's once you can't stand up and once your head goes down, you can no longer breathe.
Right. As far as crucifixion goes.
That's right.
We have this moment where the Jews come to Pilate and they say, hey, you put on the inscription on the placard above his cross, this is King of the Jews. But we want it to say, this man said, I am King of the Jews. And Pilate responds, what I have written, I have written. Now, this is an interesting exchange to me because the Romans, when they conquer a people, they're going to take their monarch or their chief and they're going to publicly humiliate them. And they don't have any qualms about calling them the actual king of that people because the emperor is higher than a king, right? The Romans, they are ruling the whole world and kings are underneath them. And so if you call Jesus the King of the Jews and he's an insurrectionist, it's no problem. The emperor can execute him. He has power over that. The Jews don't want that because they don't want Jesus to have actually been identified as the King of the Jews. They just want him to have been said that way. But Pilate's just going to say, what I've written, I've written. That's the way that I want it to be because that demonstrates the power of Rome more than anything else. And it also brings up this other point where Pilate and other authorities will often say and do things that are, in the opinion of the gospel writer, much more significant and profound than they realize that they're doing. How Pilate is talking with Jesus and has a conversation with him. There's various things in there that are said that are more profound apparently than Pilate knows. Caiaphas makes that pronouncement about Jesus dying for the people that the gospel writer says is more profound than Caiaphas knows. And here we have this thing, Jesus is King of the Jews. And for Pilate, he's just this king or insurrectionist or whatever that Rome is conquering. But for the author of the Gospels, or for the authors of the Gospels, no, Jesus really is King of the Jews, right? So Pilate's doing something more profound than he realizes.
And that's good rhetoric.
Yeah. Now, Christopher, we were talking about witnesses of the crucifixion, and there's this point in the Gospel of John.
Only
in the Gospel of John, where the mother of Jesus is there. And it's not really obvious that the mother of Jesus is there in the other Gospels, even though there is a point in the Gospel of Matthew where there is Mary that it says is the mother of James and Joseph, which are potentially brothers of Jesus. So that might be talking about Jesus's mother, but it doesn't say it's Jesus's mother. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, we didn't identify the three Marys, right?
When we look at the Gospels, there's not perfect agreement about who these women are. So we do have Mary Magdalene in three of them that she's there. So there we go. Three witnesses that Mary Magdalene was there. Okay. And then we have a Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. And in John, it says there was Jesus's mother. Now, Jesus did have a brother named James. And so it's possible that this Mary, mother of James and Joseph, is also Jesus's mother. So it's possible that's what's going on there. But then we have a third woman. And in Mark, she's just named Salome. In Matthew, she's just called the mother of Zebedee's children. So the mother of James and John. And in John, it's called Mary, the wife of Cleophas. So I don't think those are all the same person.
I can say the wife of Cleopas isn't a widow. But yeah, who are these women? I think it's significant that they're women. It's interesting that there are 3 by the name of Mary, that we cannot figure out who they are. This is almost as fun as trying to figure out who the 12 disciples are, right?
Yeah.
But you have an interesting thing that happens in John. Now, I say that an interesting thing happens in John. That's John, right?
That's John. Yeah.
So there's this interesting thing that happens where on the spot, when Jesus dies, Mary, the mother of Jesus, gets adopted, right?
Mm.
And, I think, why is this happening? So I don't think that someone outside of Mary's own children would have to adopt her because she has children. And so I just wonder how much of the author of the Gospel of John, how much of this idea of Mary's perpetual virginity is a part of his theology. I don't know. This question had never occurred to me before.
Yeah, well, this is another instance where we have this unnamed disciple, right? The disciple standing by whom he loved. And again, this is typically traditionally attributed to John. This is John the Beloved. Yeah, the idea that he would be adopting Jesus's mother as his own mother to care for her would only come into play if she were, 1, a widow, which apparently she is, but 2, had no male living children. And it's just not likely that's the case since Jesus had 4 brothers.
Ben, we talked about the virgin birth when we talked about the virgin birth, but since it comes up here, right, I'll just mention a couple of things again. 1, the word virgin that we use, it comes from Latin, right? And the Latin means a young unmarried woman, right? So that's what it means, right? A young woman, right? So the other thing is that if you, at that time, in Jesus's time and Mary's time, if you were married and you were virgin when you were married, and you got pregnant the first time that you had intercourse, and a child comes from that pregnancy, right? That's a virgin birth. That's called a virgin birth. And I'm pretty sure we said a lot more than that when we covered this, but we can refer the listener back to those episodes. There are a couple of things in the death scene, where Jesus, well, along the way, right, in this whole reading that we maybe skipped over. So one is, where he's offered wine with myrrh. And that's interesting because I didn't realize myrrh is actually a painkiller. It still is today, right? So that's one thing. And then he's also offered sour wine, vinegar, right? Mm-hmm. Vinegar is sour wine. And I don't know how people read this, but sour wine is just what Roman soldiers drank, right? That's their drink. And so maybe one of them is offering him a drink, something like that. So now we come to the burial. And here in the burial scene, Ben, the only thing that really stood out to me was that I hadn't noticed before that Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the council.
Yeah.
So that brings us back to the question that we already addressed about him earlier, right? Which is, was he there, right? When Jesus was condemned, right, by the council, or was he not? Yeah. Maybe he was. And, we brought up Abinadi and Alma, right? As another example, something, it looks like that. Yeah. Same idea. That's all I really have. I think it's been said, Joseph of Arimathea is a wealthy man, and he has this caves or where, wealthy families are buried. This goes beyond that, right? Because he gets the cave all to himself, right? It's like this individual cave burial site. And we'll pick up next week with the woman at the sepulcher and the resurrection.
All right. Thank you, Christopher. This was probably a longer than normal episode, as we expected, because this is a very dense topic, section of scripture and narrative to go through. And I don't know if we did it justice. But, there's often readings that we go through, that we've been through throughout the scriptures, that have been more intimidating than others. And you always think, oh, did I really get to everything that we should have or wanted to talk about? But I just have to constantly remind myself, my understanding of the scriptures as I go through them is evolving and changing every time I read them. And so that's just the way that it's always going to be.
Indeed. Amen. Well, thank you, Ben, for being with me. Thank you to all of our volunteers at Latter-day Peace Studies. Latter-day Peace Studies is an all-volunteer organization. It is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your donation is tax deductible. Thank you for your donations. We really appreciate those. We have very few expenses and you're helping us cover them. Thank you for that. And if you're interested in volunteering, we're always looking for volunteers. If you would like to get involved in the Latter-day Peace Studies project of promoting peace through peaceful exegesis and whatnot, whether you have any experience at all in anything we do, social media, podcasts, articles, whatever if you'd like to submit an article, please do for consideration. And then, if you don't have experience, but you would like to learn, there's an opportunity to learn on the job, right, as it were.
Well, I'll just throw my thanks in as well, and I appreciate you being here with me for this, Christopher.
Thank you for listening. Have a great week.